Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Green Supply Chain Insights. If you've been following the podcast over the last few months, you'll probably notice a recurring story theme. Back in January, after visiting Brazil and working closely with Azelen Renewables, I spoke about how the energy transition ultimately comes down to credibility. Not all sustainable fuels are the same, not all emissions reductions are the same, and without traceability, there's no way to prove the difference. One episode later, when I reviewed LRQA's climate performance and responsible sourcing risk outlook, we found something similar. Most companies have climate targets, but far fewer can independently validate them. The challenge is no longer awareness, the challenge is evidence. Then, in our last episode on the Iran conflict, we explored how geopolitical shocks expose the fragility of global supply chains, and that reminded us that resilience cannot be built in the middle of a crisis. It needs long term planning, investment, and consistency. And when I kind of combine all three of these conversations, I feel like they point to the same question. Are we actually making progress in the decarbonization of our supply chain? Not just promises and targets, but actual progress. And sometimes, depending on which headlines you follow, you could think that the climate crisis is either completely failing or it's already been solved. And as you can imagine, neither one of those is true. But over the past few weeks, I've come across three different stories that together, I think they paint a much more compelling and balanced picture of where we stand. One story gives us a reason for optimism, one exposes a contradiction at the heart of the transition, and one reminds us that policy and regulation still matter. So let's get into it. We have avoided the worst climate scenario. A few months ago, climate scientists quietly did something that was quite important. They removed the highest emission climate scenario from the latest generation of climate projections. This is by no means an indication that climate change has been solved, regardless of how some world leaders have come to conclude from this news. Current policies still put us on a trajectory of roughly 2.6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. That said, that worst case scenario was where fossil fuels and their use continue to expand aggressively, and the world would have reached 4.5 degrees Celsius of warming. That one is no longer considered plausible. And why is that? Because action has made a difference. Solar deployment, wind deployment, electric vehicles, battery storage, all of these technologies have grown faster than expected, especially in recent years, and they have materially slowed down emissions growth. So clearly, some things are working in this fight. But of course, this is by no means a victory lap. Unfortunately, scientists also removed the most optimistic pathway, the pathway that would have kept warming close to 1.5 degrees Celsius is now also out of reach because emissions have not fallen fast enough. So the lesson here is that action works, which is kind of what leads me into our second story. When some of these actions that have good intentions can create new problems. So let's talk about electric mobility and why not everything around it is great news. At first glance, this may sound somewhat absurd. Again, electric vehicles are supposed to be good news, and they are to an extent, but there is starting to be a catch. SUVs now represent around 75% of electric vehicle sales in Europe and more than 85% in the United States. As you can imagine, electrifying a vehicle does not magically remove every sustainability challenge. And the problem is that larger vehicles like SUVs require more batteries, more minerals, more energy, more road space, more material extraction. They also generate more tire and brake wear, which can lead to greater safety risk in urban environments. In a recent article from The Conversation, and we'll drop all of these links in the comments, they highlight a simple framework around electric mobility, but that I think applies far beyond it towards essentially general industrial decarbonization. The framework is that when it comes to emissions, we need to avoid, shift, and improve, and in that order. Too often, we jump directly to improve. We improve the technology, but we never ask whether the system itself is what should change. We become obsessed with technology when it comes to industrial decarbonization. Green hydrogen, carbon capture, electric vehicles, and a longer list, all of them important and useful tools, but they are not outcomes by themselves. So we need to rethink incentives so that we're not just prioritizing this technological improvement, but we're actually preempting that with avoidance of emissions. And that is key. And that also brings me to my third point, net zero tech. Why measurement is becoming the real battleground. Last week, I spent some time at Net Zero Tech in Barcelona, where a core part of the conversation this year was around measurement. Specific to Spain, we saw an extensive discussion around Gámiz, the Certificados de Ahorro Energético or Energy Efficiency Certificate. At their core, CAEs reward verified energy savings. They are a clear example of how regulators are willing to incentivize decarbonization, but they want proof. And it wasn't just regulators. At the event, you saw financial institutions and private equity investors, both of them presenting and showcasing their own sustainability-linked funding opportunities. One of my favorite messages or quotes from the event came from ESG director of Grupo Plana, José Gámiz, who said, "Sin cuentas, todos son cuentos," which loosely translates to, without measurements, it's all story. It's all stories, sorry. It sounds better in Spanish. So if we go back to that framework, avoid, shift, and improve, electric vehicles are an example of technological improvement. Energy efficiency certificates are a great example of avoidance. So now let's look at what the shift part of the framework can look like. The bottle cap lesson. I recently read an opinion piece by Alberto Alemano in The Guardian, anchored around this incredibly simple and yet such a polemic topic, plastic bottle caps. The article argued that the EU requirement for attached bottle caps is a perfect example of why regulation matters. The rule was mocked time and time again. People laughed at it, many called it unnecessary bureaucracy, and yet companies adapted to it almost immediately. But what most of these joking commentators missed is that this rule wasn't invented out of thin air. Bottle caps have consistently ranked among the most common items found in European beach cleanups. They are small, they are light, they used to separate from the bottle, so they travel longer distances. That makes them harder to recover, and it makes it more easily to be ingested by marine wildlife. So the objective here was very simple. It was to reduce the number of loose caps entering the environment. And one thing the article points to, which is particularly revealing, is that many companies did not introduce the same design changes globally. That's not because the environmental problem disappears outside of Europe, but because the regulation only existed in Europe. So we often hear how regulation kills innovation, yet this is an example of how regulation is driving a simple yet relevant innovation for a positive environmental impact. And clearly, again, the benefit of attached bottle caps is not going to solve plastic pollution. But that's besides the point. The point here is that regulation shifted responsibility away from millions of individual consumers, and it placed it on the companies who are best positioned to solve this problem at scale. So when regulation is evidence-based, is proportionate, that doesn't weaken competitiveness. That can create markets and standards, and it can accelerate that decarbonization at scale. As Alberto concludes in the article, these type of initiatives accelerate the adoption of better practices that otherwise would have taken years to happen, or maybe never happen at all. So let's look ahead to the upcoming EU Green Week. On June 18, we will be hosting an official partner event of the EU Green Week. The event titled Investing in Nature Through Transparent Industrial Value Chains. We're going to be covering digital traceability from soil restoration to circular products. I'll be joined by Pedro Estrella from Acelen Renewables, Harry Marshall from Open Atlas, in a conversation that will be moderated by my colleague Flavia Sales. Together, we'll be exploring how traceability, transparency, and digital tools help transform sustainability from a reporting exercise into something measurable and investable. Because whether we're talking about soil restoration, renewable fuels, circular products, or industrial decarbonization as a whole, the same principle applies. If we can't measure it, we can't improve it. And if we can't prove it, nobody should be expected to trust it. So, to recap, the fact that scientists have removed the worst case climate scenario should give us hope. The rise of electric SUVs should remind us that progress is rarely straightforward. And the bottle cap story should remind us that regulation, when done well, can change behavior faster than we often expect. So, progress is happening, but that progress needs evidence. Remember what José said, sin cuentas, todos son cuentos. Thank you for listening, and as always, you can find Green Supply Chain Insights on LinkedIn, Spotify, and YouTube. See you next time.